Hello, everyone, and welcome. Good evening if you're in the UK, good morning if you're in the US, and thank you, Simon Sinek, for joining us. There's a year and a half long competition that's been running on screens everywhere. Who has the best backdrop? And it's now official. Simon, you've won, and I have resoundingly lost. I'm really tempted to talk about all the sort of big ideas that you have, but I'd really most like to talk about who's in charge of hotel room decor in the world. There must be someone somewhere that does this. So I'd like to talk about that. Simon, you were really kind. We just got started at Tortoise, and I should inform sort of all Tortoise members are joining us. Simon was one of the people who helped us think most when we were setting up Tortoise. Katie Vanek-Smith, my co-founder, but particularly Matthew Barson, our chairman, me, and we talked about what the ethos was, what the culture of it was, but as you'd expect of Simon, also what the whole purpose of it was, why we were doing it. And so Simon has been brilliant in helping us think every time we've kind of iterated things. It was actually with Simon that we held the first ThinkIn, where we realized that we weren't going to allow questions, that our approach was to say, no, we want to hear what you think, and realized what we would learn by not introducing questions, introducing people, inviting them to have opinions and have statements. And so for those people who've not joined us before, I just want to say, welcome to a ThinkIn. They typically happen in our newsroom. As it happens today, I'm in Manchester. British political ritual dictates that every year there's a Conservative Party conference and a Labour Party conference. This week is Conservative, so I'm here in Manchester. But typically they happen in our newsroom. And the theory of Tortoise has been, we want to open up journalism and open up our newsroom, and we want everyone to step in. And in order to make it work, we found the best way was to have everyone step in with their point of view. Tell us what you think. And so in the course of this hour, I hope you'll hear little from me, a whole load from Simon, but a fair bit from yourselves. Please weigh in with your points of view. And what Simon and I were going to do was to try to kick things off by having a conversation about how much our mindset's been changed, how much we see our own lives differently, our working lives differently, and our world differently in the light of this long last 18 months. And so if you've got any thoughts on that, please weigh in the chat, stick up your digital hand. I'll bring you in. My colleague, the great Liz Mosley, is there doing her best to try and shepherd the chat. So between us, we'll try and make sense of it. And with that, Simon, over to you. Where do you want to start? Your life? I see one thing in your life seems to have changed. You're in LA.
I am accidentally in Los Angeles, yes. The pandemic pushed us around. My sister lives here, so I thought when it struck, I would come out here because she's here, and we basically lived like a family of five, and instead of me as a family of one. And turns out I'm staying here a lot longer than was originally planned, but roll with the punches. But I think that's actually a good segue into how easily a mindset can shift, whether it's shifted for us or whether we choose to shift it or not change it for that matter. And I'll just as a nice little metaphor, I was working out during the pandemic with a friend of mine. We would work out on a regular basis over FaceTime. So we'd set up FaceTime and we would just do the same workout together, on opposite sides of the country. And this is something we did multiple times a week. And we were doing one particularly difficult workout together. And it was right in the middle of the workout. I stopped and I said, I've got some good news and some bad news. And she said, well, what's the bad news? I said, well, the bad news is we're only halfway done. She says, well, what's the good news? I said, the good news is we're already halfway done. And it's amazing how simply changing the tone of voice literally sets one's mood and one's ability to do this next half of difficult things. It either becomes all downhill or all uphill. That's mindset and the power of mindset.
I want to ask you about that, because one of the things that you, of course, did do, right, in this time was launch the podcast, A Bit of Optimism. And I want to know how hard you found it to sustain that in this last year and a half, because for more people, it's been a time of uncertainty, really.
Sure. Look, I went through the same rhythms as everybody else. We all had our bouts of depression. We all had our bouts of panic. I mean, not always at the same times. Some lasted longer than others, and some it came and went and still keeps coming back. So, I mean, no one's immune from suffering the effects of trauma. Let's just put that aside. But I don't think that I don't think it's difficult to maintain optimism even in difficult times. One of the lessons I learned, and I learned it during my depression during COVID, which is we can have as human beings multiple feelings simultaneously. And I think some people, when we're surrounded by death or friends losing incomes and jobs and massive uncertainties and all of this, that there's a sense of guilt that some of us feel when we have a positive feeling, excitement or optimism. And the reality is we can have both. You can be excited and sad at the same time. You can be optimistic and depressed at the same time. Like those things are actually possible. And that was huge. That was a huge insight for me, that I can live in both spaces simultaneously. And I can be distraught for what's going on in the world and optimistic for what the future holds. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, it's been quite, I won't say easy, but simple to be optimistic despite all the other feelings that I have.
And Simon, do you think people are divided, aren't they? Some people say, actually, you know what, as we emerge from this pandemic, actually, we're going to find we quote unquote go back to normal, we go back to life as we are, we're much more habitual than we think. And others say, no, I think it is going to be a real fork in the road. What do you think?
I mean, one of the things I'm totally fascinated by is what will happen to young people. Like our grandparents, who lived through the war, for example, parents or grandparents who lived through the war, for the rest of their lives, they reused every piece of tinfoil and saved every jam jar, right? And there's nothing wrong with them. It's because they lived through rations. And so it affected their worldview. Mm-hmm. It affected how they lived the rest of their lives. And so it is still an unknown how for a young generation, what lasting effects it'll have, but I'm fascinated by it. Will they wash their hands obsessively for the rest of their lives and their grandkids will make fun of them because they're always washing their hands? I don't know. Mm-hmm. But it has to have an impact. It can't not have an impact. People complained that because we're wearing masks the whole time, you don't see expressions. Maybe this generation will get really good at reading people's eyes because they're much better at eye contact. I don't know. But I think to say that we're going to go back to quote unquote normal is ridiculous, not because things have changed, but because things were invented. Mm-hmm. New things happened. Organizations that didn't think they could ever function remotely are now remote. Mm-hmm. Friendships that we never thought we could maintain remotely, we did. Now, that's not to say it can replace in-person. Of course, in-person is always better. But the point was there's new technologies, the rise of Zoom, companies were reinvented, companies pivoted, things changed. And some of it was good. A lot of it was good, even though it was born out of necessity. So there's no turning that switch off.
And do you? I see two of our members, Lisa G and Andrew Goddard, have already got into this conversation about screens versus in person. I always like it when I get an email from you. I always know it's from you because there's almost always a line in kind of small orange print that I kind of lean forward and then it reads something like, breathe. And once you've done that, go on and read the rest of the email, or don't read this until you really have to. Do you think that there has been something just in the volume of our screen time, in the kind of boundarylessness, if that's even a word, of our work intruding into our home, that has been corrosive, that you've worried about how we've related to ourselves and our work?
Well, the simple answer is yes. Look, nothing replaces in person. There are things that it's like, you can meet somebody through an app, but you still have to sort of meet them if you're going to end up in a lifelong relationship with them. Like nothing replaces chemistry, whatever it is. Good luck having a brainstorming session over Zoom. Like it doesn't work. Like the whole brainstorming is about interrupting each other, which is actually doesn't work on Zoom. It's noisy and it's impolite, but in real life, it's fun. So I think that to online relationships are online relationships and in-person relationships, but they don't replace each other. They're just different animals, but nothing replaces in person. Nothing.
And do you think, and Simon, do you think, given how much that people look to you to think about culture, and a lot of it is in the workplace, and there's a real question about whether or not you can actually build culture, whether you can transmit ways of working and values digitally. Have you had lots of people come to you and say, listen, help us figure this out? How do we communicate? How do we listen? How do we talk?
Yeah, well, I've had a virtual company, a distributed company for 10 years. So when the pandemic hit, like being a distributed team was actually, it changed nothing. Like we were always like that. The difference is our product was an in-person product. That's what disappeared. But I think one of the things that people don't realize is that it is doable. You still need to get together once a year for a company offsite at the very minimum. There's still people who will travel around, have meetings and get together. I mean, it doesn't replace. And I think the thing that people don't realize is, though it is possible to transfer values and things digitally, it requires more work. Isaac Stern, the famous violinist, said, music is what happens between the notes. Well, trust is what happens between the meetings. And it's the walking into the meeting, it's the walking out of the meeting, it's the bumping into somebody in the hallway, it's knocking on their door and saying, do you have a minute, do you want to grab a cup of coffee? And over the course of time, relationships grow and trust builds. In an online world, we only have the meeting. There's no before or after, there's no in between the meetings. There's none of the chit chat and casual stuff that is where trust is formed. And so to do it digitally means you have to do it prescriptively. It requires more work. We do a Monday morning huddle where every Monday morning the whole team comes together and we talk about what's on our heart and mind, and we answer either a funny or poignant question, whatever the host poses. And that's it. There is no discussion of work. And we get to learn about each other. Who had a happy weekend? Who had a sad weekend? Whose parent is in the hospital? Whose dog threw up on the rug? Like we learn all of that stuff about each other. And that's essential. Also, we encourage people to use the telephone. It's something strange about this Zoom thing. The technology is not quite there. I think I'm making eye contact with you, but what you see is this because the placement of my camera and my screen. Or rather, I want you to feel like I'm making eye contact with you, but I'm looking at a green dot the whole time. Or I'm looking at myself, so my eyes are darting all over the place. And so I find that telephone, believe it or not, like if somebody is reading their email, it's hard to interrupt them and tell them to stop. But when someone's on the phone and you hear that they're distracted, you say, "Are you listening to me?"
You can hear.
Sorry. And for some reason, I find that the intimacy of a phone call is sometimes greater than the intimacy of a Zoom call. Plus you can walk around, and I'm a pacer, so that there's that too.
It's right. Although, isn't it also the case that there's something really, all of those studies about how the best conversations happen in cars when both people are looking at the same direction and not necessarily at each other. There's obviously something to that. I want to start bringing some people in. I want to bring in Carol Francis Johnston, who's made this point about, and I don't know whether you're there, Carol, but you've made this point about how this digital experience has quote unquote flattened relationships. Carol, I see that you read that, but I don't know whether you've experienced it.
I haven't experienced it as much as a colleague of mine who is in counseling and works with trafficked teens. And her team had to meet on Zoom for many, many months to discuss specific cases. And then she had to meet on FaceTime often with the teens in question. And she just found it very difficult to really connect with the kids because of the distance and not being able to have that kind of interaction that you can have when you're in the room together.
I mean, yes, you can't see someone fidgeting. If you see my leg bouncing or you see my hands fidgeting, you can tell I'm uncomfortable and something's wrong, and you can query about that, or you can change your tone of voice. Whereas here, you get nothing. I can lie, hide, and fake, or disappear a lot easier. Or rather, to your point, all those cues that help us relate to each other are hidden from screen view.
And is there though an element of this? There's an element. Carol, thank you. I just want to bring in Lisa's point. Lisa, I don't know whether you're there, and I'm going to come to Julia Thomas if I might. But Lisa, because I worry that some of this community, these new platforms have actually been very good for people who couldn't get heard. You know, I mean, certainly if you look at this, Simon, you and I are talking, but I can see a kind of waterfall of chats and comments. When we did this in the newsroom, I was sort of picking up on people's non-verbals, which are very powerful, no doubt, but I couldn't hear people directly weighing in. And Lisa, where are you there? Yes, hello there.
I'm here.
Hi there. I mean, because you spoke about it being equalizing, more democratic, you're far away.
Okay, I mean, I've heard even quite senior women tell me that they find Zoom meetings much easier because it's much harder for the pompous older white men to dominate.
Hang on.
So that's that. And I also do I facilitate an inclusion panel. So I work with a lot of people, disabled people who can't often get in the room. And this change has been fantastic for a lot of disabled people because it's enabled them to get what they've been asking for years, in order to be able to contribute properly in the workplace. And it enables me to communicate. And it means that, as someone else mentioned in the chat, you've got the chat happening as well. You've got, in a lot of ways, it can be a lot richer. But then I'm someone I've been sort of doing online work for ages, and I've been working remotely for 20 years. So again, I like it.
Yeah, I think what Lisa's pointing at is correct, which is it's not either or, it's both. And I think to have the debate, which is better, like should we do this or should we do that? Should we go back to the 100% in-person office or should we go 100%? And the answer is no. The answer is we have both of these tools and we can take advantage of the advantages they both offer, that one needn't replace the other. They can work in concert. And I think, not to go too far off the reservation here, but the debate, whether it's either or, unfortunately, at least where I live in the United States, everything here is binary. Yeah. Everything here is right, wrong, good, bad, this side, that side, and we don't understand that two things can exist simultaneously for the greater benefit. So I think Lisa's right. We don't want to do away with or replace. We want to find ways to bolster and include.
So forgive me, Julia, before I come to you, I'm just going to go to Aviva Wittenberg-Cox, if you're there, just because I want to come to these big questions of leadership, political and cultural in a moment that Julia's raised. But Aviva, you make a really interesting point about the difference between introverts and extroverts and what works for whom. And I'm just interested to know, well, tell us what you think.
I'd say both personality type and power. There's a little bit of a conversation going about relative power. And it's a tremendous leveler between the people who are totally confident, extroverted, used to interrupt, the people in the brainstorming rooms of Simon who love to interrupt, and the introverts who've always hated those meetings and never been able to think quite fast enough to say what they wanted to say. And I'm arguing with somebody, Andrew, I think, about whether anybody needs to know about his personal life. When we're talking about Simon saying he's having meetings dedicated to how people feel for decades, the corporate mantra has been this compartmentalization of personal and professional, which men often love and women mostly are incapable of and hate. So that idea of bring your whole self to work is something that many people don't like, particularly the introverts, again, who are going to be less comfortable. So there's a lot of stuff going on in this online, offline conversation, much more than just tech. But I think the tech is giving voice to a whole bunch of people who never had it before in a much more equal way.
Aviva, that is what I've seen. I mean, the companies that I've been talking to, it has been a great equalizer. And some of the conversations I've been having with some leaders about whether they should go back 100% one way or 100% the other way, this was one of the topics that came up, which is, what about your introverts? This has been a huge boon. You're getting their thinking that hasn't been happened before. I will add, though, good leadership should be able to mitigate that if there are people who are quiet in a brainstorming, a good leader will interrupt or stop the blowhards and say, we haven't heard from Stacy in a while. Stacy, what are your thoughts? And we all quiet and wait for Stacey to form her thoughts. So I think good leadership mitigates a lot of that as well.
Aviva, thank you. Simon, can we, we started off saying, okay, let's try and figure out how our mindset has shifted in the past 18 months. And I wonder whether you could talk about that in the context of leadership itself, because that point you made about trust is what happens between the meetings. If you look at things globally, nationally, politically, certainly in my world, in terms of media information, it's been an assault on trust in lots of different ways. And I wonder how you make sense of that and how you think we respond to that.
That's a big question. The best way I think I can articulate the situation we're in right now is it's a mess. And COVID has only piled on to the scrum. I think the changing world order, the rise of China, the political upheaval that we have in the United States, which is decline of trust in government, which leads to these things. One of the things that I've become fascinated with is this idea of control, and how when we feel in control or don't feel in control, how that affects almost everything. And so, for example, for us, the January 6th uprising, data shows that a disproportionately high number of the people who are involved in that day either are suffering or have suffered significant financial problems, whether it's personal bankruptcy or significant debt, or layoffs. And so the feeling like I'm not in control of my own destiny, my own work, my own life, it gives rise to anger, looking to blame, a supremacist point of view. It also gives rise to an open-mindedness to conspiracy theories, because they give a sense of control when I feel out of control. And so I think what's fascinating is how people responded to losing control. And human beings, we're very tribal animals. We want to have a sense of belonging. And when we feel rejected or pushed away, we seek it anywhere else. The most fascinating thing about the angriest groups is they actually seek belonging in the very group that they're criticized the most. Though they find belonging in these minority groups, they actually see, like Donald Trump wishes the New York Times would write a good article about him. It's stuff like that. Like the one he criticizes the most is the one he wants to praise him. And it's just a fascinating thing. And so I become really interested in that. You can see these are forming thoughts. They're a little discombobulated, but this idea of how our own sense of personal control over our lives and our destiny. Just to go back.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Just to interrupt you, forgive me 1 second. Because when we started Tortoise, and sorry to kind of reflect back one of the things that you were saying, when we started it, I remember Kerry Thomas, who's one of our editors here, we all talked about what's it really about, right? And I remember Richard Curtis said, a newsroom really is trying to understand injustice. It's trying to understand where humans bump up against other humans unfairly. And at the time, it was really clear that there was this sort of sweeping sense post-financial crisis in the decade since that there was inequality, right? But actually, the thing that Kerry pointed to, he said, the thing that really I find most worrying is the power gap, is this sense of powerlessness. And actually, all across the map, I think what you see is a sense of powerlessness, whether it's powerlessness in democracy or powerlessness West versus East, or a powerlessness versus big tech, or, a powerlessness versus the pandemic. And so I'm interested that you're kind of seizing on this idea of control, right, which is a very human instinct in response to structural powerlessness, right? It's not that this is an imagined problem, it's a problem. So how do you, if you like, marry the big external picture you see and the personal internal need for control?
So one of the things we have to learn to do is listen, and it's a skill, and it is a skill. It's not innate. It's a skill that is not taught in school, and it's not taught in companies, which is teaching people how to listen actively, which is to listen for meaning, to listen between the lines, not just to be able to parrot back the words, and to replace judgment with curiosity. and it's incredibly difficult. And we've devolved even more than we were because of online into beings that speak at each other but not with each other. And the question is, well, who's going to go first? I had the opportunity to talk to Dia Khan. I'm sure you know the BAFTA award-winning documentarian who did the documentary White Right, and she's done research with white supremacists and jihadis, and she's remarkable. And she's capable of practicing extreme listening. This Muslim woman who sits down with these white supremacists who hate her, but she gave them a safe space to feel heard, which is an amazing thing to behold. To the point where they question their own loyalties to the white supremacist movement because it's in such conflict with their real feelings of friendship towards Dia. And I asked Dia, in this crazy time after, with the rise of Black Lives Matter and January 6th, who goes first? And she says, you won't like my answer. She goes, but in all of her work, she has found that it's the victim who has to go first, which is very uncomfortable, because those who are victimized will say, well, I shouldn't have to go first. I've spent a whole life being victimized. It's their turn. They have to listen to me, And Dia's point of view is, yes, that may be fair and just, but it's the victim who has to give the safe space to the oppressor first, so they can, as she calls it, empty their bucket. And at that moment, listening actually happens. And we live in a world where both sides refuse to go first, and both sides can claim victimization, which means both sides have the opportunity to go first.
Sorry, I'm not being really stupid here. Are you saying go first meaning listen first?
Listen first. Create safe space for the other to feel heard. And that's my definition of listening. It's not about hearing the words, but it's getting to the point where the other party feels heard. Not that you heard the words, but they feel heard, which is a high standard. And if anybody's had a romantic relationship, honey, you're not listening to me, and you say back the words, doesn't solve the problem, but sometimes all they need to do is feel heard, which is sometimes doesn't require fixing or anything. It just requires saying, go on, I hear you, what else? It's about creating space.
And just out of interest, you say we don't teach listening at schools and we don't teach listening in companies. Are there any schools or companies or organizations that you look at and you think these people are really good they've got a really good culture of listening?
Yeah, there's a few that I've stumbled upon. Weirdly, the ones that come to my mind are all industrial companies, but WD-40, the lubricant company, they're really good at it. Barry Waymiller, a company I've written about multiple times, which is a large manufacturing company. But the one I'll tell you about it's called the Luck Companies. They own quarries. They make gravel. Like, that's what they do. Like, they own quarries. And the people who work there are every stereotype that you have in your mind, 350 pounds, no college education, barely a high school degree, a trucker cap and chewing tobacco, like all of the stereotypes that you have, true. I went to visit one of their quarries, and we're sitting around a room with these wonderful folks. And I said to them, I asked one guy who fits, Bubba, it was probably his name. And I said, can you tell me what you've learned, what it means for you to be at the Luck Companies? And he leans and he goes, well, I've learned to express my feelings in a constructive way so that not only do I get heard, but the people who I'm talking to feel heard. And it's been very validating. And it's also improved the quality of my relationships with my wife and my kids. I mean, so the point is you can teach listening wherever, and it's applicable in anywhere there's human beings, and it's a magical thing when it happens. And almost all the places that I've seen companies that teach listening, the people will always respond by saying that it's improved the quality of the relationships with their spouses and children, almost 100%.
So Simon, sorry, I've done a classic thing, which is say, so I want to make sure that we hear from Julia Thomas, and then got kind of sucked in. So forgive me, Julia, but would you weigh in? The reason is Julia made a comment really, really early on, Simon, about excuses and leadership. And I don't know, Julia, whether you stuck with us. I've got fantastically distracted. No, there you are. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Simon. So recently you posted that excuses don't help make things better. They only offer a rationale to avoid trying. So in your view, it'd be interesting to know, do you think our political leaders at the moment are giving excuses on issues like climate change, racism, in a bid to avoid trying? And if you had any one piece of advice to them, what would it be?
Well, the asked and answered, yes, 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 resounding. There's been I'm a complete devotee to the thinking of Dr. James Carse, who wrote in the mid-1980s Finite and Infinite Games. And I'll just, for those who don't know, I'll pose really quickly. He posited these two definitions, that there are finite games and infinite games. A finite game is defined as known players, fixed rules, and an agreed upon objective. Football, there's a beginning, middle, and an end. And if there's a winner, then necessarily there has to be a loser. Then you have infinite games. Infinite games are defined as known and unknown players, which means new players can join anytime and you don't necessarily know who all the players are. The rules are changeable, which means every player can play however they want. And the objective is to stay in the game as long as possible, to perpetuate the game. We are players in infinite games every day of our lives, whether we know it or not. There's no such thing as winning education. You can come in first for the finite amount of time you're at school, but we agree upon the time frame and the metrics there, grades. But nobody wins education. Nobody's declared the winner of careers. There's no such thing as winning global politics. And there's definitely no such thing as winning business. But when we listen to the language of so many of our leaders these days, it becomes abundantly clear that they don't know the game they're playing in. They talk about being number one, being the best, or beating their competition. Well, this is a problem, because when we play with a finite mindset in an infinite game, when we play to win in a game that has no finish line, there's some very consistent and predictable outcomes: the decline of trust, the decline of cooperation, and the decline of innovation. And I would argue that over the past 40 years or so, we've seen a dramatic rise of finite thinking, where we hear the words winning and being first way more in places that it doesn't exist, in business and in politics, which necessarily means that timeframes have to become shorter and shorter, because I can control the outcome in a quarter, maybe even a year, but I can't control the outcome, in 5 years or 10 years. And so we've seen a dramatic increase in finite thinking across the board, politically, foreign policy, business, schools. In the United States, universities, places of higher learning advertise themselves based on the starting salaries of their graduates, not what kind of human beings they're churning out or what kind of education you're going to get. And so to answer your question, what we're seeing is, because the timeframes are so short and people only think in terms of winning and losing rather than governance or improving or growing or these kinds of words that we like that are necessary for things like climate change and race relations, because there's no winning in any of these situations, there's only improving and growing. The problem is people with a finite mindset are making those decisions. And so to your point, there's a huge amount of excuses and rationalizations because they want to justify short-term actions or not doing the right thing for the long term, because it might mean a short-term liability. And as anybody who's ever tried to get into shape, who's been out of shape, there's always pain before you start getting into it. Whenever you change your lifestyle and go on a long-term course of health, usually there's a dip first. And we live in a society where people are so afraid of that dip. Unfortunately, it's necessary. And so what we get is short-term Band-Aids.
But Simon, can I ask you, sorry, I don't know, Julie, do you want to come back on that?
No, thank you, I'm okay.
Julie, thank you. Can I just, Simon, can I just ask you something about that though, which is, I've been trying to figure out why it is that we think more carefully and more purposefully about the way we live and work, and yet we seem more worried about the outcomes, right? More worried about climate outcomes, economic outcomes, political outcomes. And I just wanted to put this to you, which is, you can start with why. You can think about your own life and your own business life or organizational life. But if you operate within a system that rewards the wrong things, then in the end, even if you think purposefully, you might systemically end up in the wrong place. And I wonder how much you've begun to worry that the way the economy works, or the way democracy works, the way the systems work, mean that good people with good intentions can still end up with bad outcomes.
It goes right back to Julie's questions, right? Julia's question. Show me how someone's paid, and I'll tell you how they behave. All good intentions are turned on their head when we have an incentive structure that rewards short-termism or individualism. And we don't have good structures to reward teamwork or long-term decision making. And so it's what we get. And again, I would bucket that with the rise of the finite thinking, which is even our incentive structures have become more finite and individualistic. And at the end of the day, the things that solve these problems are difficult long-term decision making that sometimes come with short-term liability and teamwork. That's how every single one of these problems is solved. And it goes back to those listening skills, which is one of those skills of teamwork, which is, you can't make peace with your friends. You can only make peace with enemies. And so to make peace means engaging rather than demanding. And yet I think the theater of competition, whether it's corporate or political, I think plays to the short-term ambitions of the people who are perpetuating it.
I guess the reason I ask you and just press you a bit further on it is I've always been struck by the fact that you've taken this you've got this sort of weird life where you're like, on the one hand, you're into some really groovy tech companies, talking to them about how they organize. On the other hand, you're sitting with, people who are doing heavy industries, you said, but then you'll flip and go and say, okay, I'm going to speak to the military people. Right. And you've got this relationship with the military, which is really interesting. All of that must make you think quite a lot about security, right? And in the context of the last few years, you touched on it, China and the US, just, the global competition we're in. And I wonder how your thinking on that has changed.
Well, the interesting thing about all the problems are the same. And so that's fascinating. The big difference is when you talk about military or politics, the stakes are much higher for obvious reasons. It's not like, oh, we're going to miss our quarter and disappoint shareholders. Like the stakes are real. And I think the United States is behind the eight ball. I think there's no disputing that. The United States made a huge foreign policy blunder when the Berlin Wall came down, which is they declared themselves the winner of the Cold War. But there's no such thing as winning in an infinite game. All that happens is the players drop out and new players will eventually replace them. When Circuit City went bankrupt, Best Buy didn't win anything. Well, the Soviet Union was Circuit City and the United States was Best Buy, and China is Amazon. And so now Best Buy has to completely change the way it does business to fit Amazon, not the other way around. And that's the infinite game. And so I think we are struggling to understand what security means. It's not a nuclear threat anymore. The nuclear is not an existential threat like it was during Cold War 1.0, where yes, North Korea could attack the United States, but it can't annihilate the United States from the face of the earth, at least not yet. It could sort of take off half of it. So it's not fully existential. We don't fear an existential threat from terrorism. They can cause damage and wreak havoc and create terror, but annihilate a nation, it's not happening. The thing that we're not talking about is economic. And I think that if you look at the way that warfare, dare I say it, is waged these days, it'll be economic warfare, where the mutually assured destruction that existed between the Soviet Union and the United States back in the Cold War 1.0 and Cold War 2.0, the mutually assured destruction is economic, and you can see the proxy wars that they're fighting, which is let's shut down a pipeline, let's shut down a meat packing plant, and we'll screw with your economy a little bit. And there's shots across the bow to say, if we go to war, you'll turn on your computers and you'll look in your bank account and it'll say zero, because banking is electronic. You'll have no electricity, you'll have no gasoline, you'll have no supply chain, which means you'll have no food, and we'll shut down your economy. But the mutually assured destruction is we can do it back to them as well. And hopefully that maintains a status quo. But you can see this rise of this new Cold War that's happening at an economic level, not at a military level.
So I want to, if I can, bring in Chester Crocker, if he's here. I don't know whether, I've known Chet Crocker for many years. He's actually not only a wonderful old friend, but a great hero of mine, in that he's one of the sort of those great diplomats who actually has spent a lot of time doing some serious listening. Hello, Chet. But I wonder what you make of what Simon's saying about the ability of leaders to listen, because you made a point in the chat about did President Biden listen on Afghanistan? Did Bush listen on Iraq?
Well, I think the biggest problem is that we have so much of a temptation in many organizations to to speak to the converted, to speak to our own audience, to speak to the people that are already part of our domestic constituency. And you see it, of course, a lot in the US-China relationship. You can be absolutely certain that what's said in public is meant for domestic consumption on both sides. So then you have this imagery of the administration going to Geneva and talking to the Russians about some kind of dialogue on strategic stability issues. And there were real adults in the room. I can't speak for the Russian adult, but the American adult was Wendy Sherman, and she's a listener. And if anyone can bring anything back to Washington in terms of ideas about how to move beyond New START, how to think about AI and space and cyber and so forth, it would be her. So, but I think it's really hard to do. It's hard to do because there's so much temptation to be told by your press advisors that what counts is what people on the Hill will think, or what counts is the domestic audience and not the foreign audience.
And Chet, can I just ask you, do they teach you? I mean, I asked Simon whether there are organizations where they teach you how to listen. You'd kind of like to think that the State Department, the Foreign Service, in diplomacy, they teach you that. But do they?
I doubt if they teach you on the job how to do that. I mean, it's really a question of what kind of a person are you? And I put this to Simon. I think there are people who are born listeners, or else they learn through the hard knocks of the first 21 years of their life that they damn well better listen. If they don't listen, they're gonna have to find some other way to get along. But I really don't know if you can train diplomats to do that. Supposedly graduate school should do that if people are listening to each other around a seminar table. I've been teaching for years, and I like to listen to my students as well as talk to them. But I think it's a very personal thing, James.
Simon, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I having taken a listening class, it can be taught. How well someone does in the listening class is a different conversation. But listening can be taught. And, I find it uncomfortable. And Chester, I agree with you that it's probably not being taught at state or other places. I know it's not being taught, at DOD, at least not en masse. But I find it uncomfortable that we're relying on basically a game of roulette, the hope that someone had a good experience or a good upbringing, that they learn listening somewhere else. Where, like I said, we can teach it. That doesn't mean everyone will excel in the class, but I think it dramatically increases the odds of having more good listeners in an organization if we're actively teaching them to it, and maybe creating incentive structures and bonuses based on how well they do in the class.
That's Ryan Stocky had his hand up. I don't know whether Ryan, we were a little digital hand up. Ryan, did you want to weigh in? If only to just show us that you're in a beautiful place.
I'm just in a small town in North Dakota in my backyard. No, I raised my hand when you mentioned the individuals and how. Oh, sorry, I think I was muted.
No, we can hear you.
Okay, got you. So you mentioned individuals and starting with why, and how some of us are trying to make these sorts of decisions and think. And I was wondering if either of you guys, I've thought of it as almost like we are the individual cells, and maybe if enough of us make those changes, then will we see, the changes move up the chain and see more systemic change. I was wondering if you thought that thought process was rational or, maybe flawed.
I think you're 100% correct. I think if we're going to go back to politics or even business, but I think that our politicians are a reflection of us. We complain that they're short-term minded, that they don't listen. Well, maybe it's us. And I concur. I think change starts at home. Are we practicing listening with our children? Are we practicing, good social media habits with our children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Are we able to resolve conflict with our friends or people we don't like? I have one friendship that I'm very, very proud of, where our politics are totally opposite, and we see the world very, very differently. And based on current norms of the day, I should hate her, but we're not. We're friends, and we're very close friends because she's a good person. She cares about me. She gives me a safe space to be myself. And I remember once we went for a walk and we had a political discussion, and she raised a conspiracy theory that I don't buy into. And I know that I thought it, but I fear that I said it. I said, how can you be so stupid? And that's when and then she looked at me and I attacked the person, not the idea. And that's when I realized I had the problem. And this friendship, and we both talk about it, how this friendship that we have has taught us both to find common ground, that even when we disagree so violently, that we don't get violent about it, but rather we pose questions to the other, not in an aggressive way, but in a desire to understand. And we almost always find some overlap. And it's the point we find some overlap that we can find some common ground, that we can actually then we become more open-minded to each other's point of view. And we have, you live in the United States, that the whole sort of Thanksgiving table joke, with political opposites at the Thanksgiving tables become a real thing here, of like family members who won't talk to each other. That's really upsetting. So to your point, like if we can learn to talk to our families with violently different political points of view, then there's no reason why others can't do it. So I completely agree. I think change starts at home.
Can I just to say, Ryan, one of the things that we tried to do when we set up Tortoise was this idea of civilized disagreement. So in that spirit, I should say that my concern is the exact opposite. My biggest concern is that good people strive and in their own individual ways keep doing good things, and yet there are these systemic problems, right, either with the way in which the marketplace works or the information marketplace works or the way in which technology concentrates power or democracy is polarizing people, particularly in the internet age, and that even when you work well, you don't necessarily get to good outcomes. So, perhaps that's the reason why Simon ends up being an inspirational thinker and I end up being a journalist. We each kind of are pulled by our magnetic.
Well, James, if I may civilly disagree with you,
yeah,
which is, I'm always struck when people talk about the system. Well, Simon, it's the system. I'm like, what system are we talking about? The system is us. We built all these systems. We built all the mechanisms. We maintain. The systems of corporate power are done because there's conflicts of interest where money come into play. I mean, this whole Facebook revelation where they chose money over democracy. The system was built by a couple of people sitting in a room going, no, let's choose this. Facebook didn't announce anything. One or two people sat in a room and go, we should do this. And then Facebook made an announcement or had a policy. So I think that this system, I think, is not, it's ethereal. It's us.
I agree with that. But I guess the reason why I'm going to bring in my colleague, Matt Dancona, who's going to make a kind of more eloquent and insightful point. But the reason why I worry, Simon and Ryan, is that some of these big systemic changes that need to be addressed, returned, aren't. And so, for example, if you take, let's say, for example, you take the issue, let's take one particular issue. We've been discussing recently, cyber, right? How do you create some security in an age where there's greater cyber insecurity? We are in a trade-off between really key values, right? Liberty and privacy on the one hand, right? And security on the other. And so far, what we've seen is that there's not been a willingness to change the system. And as a result, certain benefits have accrued to bad people at the expense of good. And that's what I mean within the system. And as an individual,
yeah,
I think that's difficult to change. Anyway, this is we know taken a real, but Ryan, you've taken us something different. Let me bring in my colleague Matt, if I might, because Matt, I know you wanted to weigh in.
Yes. Hi, Simon. Well, first of all, on systems, you're both right in the sense that, Simon's right on the sort of Margaret Mead level, never doubt that a small group of citizens, thoughtful, committed citizens, can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Agency is all. But to take your Facebook example, Simon, yes, okay, it was a group of people with Zuckerberg doing something together, but I think it would be idle to deny that it has a systemic dimension now, to which people are subject in ways over which they have no control, other than to switch it off. I mean, the algorithm is nothing if not a system. So yeah. I do think there is such a thing as the system, and of course, you know, it interacts with agency. But to say that you seem to me to be implying that I mean, it's the old reification argument, you know, that got Margaret Thatcher into so much trouble when she said there's no such thing as society, there are only individuals and families within it. Actually, there is such a thing as society. There are things that are not just the aggregate of the elements within them. And I think systems, and particularly complex systems of the sort that we're all part of now, are very important. I just wanted to quickly weigh in with on I think brilliant points about curiosity and doubt you made, and I worry that they are very, very scarce now, because the culture in which we live, to use another abstraction, privileges certainty, and indeed it's now seems a sign of weakness to express a lack of certainty. You know, in fact, in the current context, it's a sign of you know, it is a sign of courage to say I'm not sure. But we've reverted to it's an odd business, because we've borrowed some of the old Marxian Hegelian teleologies to have this notion of the right side of history, and everyone is, you know, positioning themselves as being on the right side of history, polarized and full of an often bogus and extremely two-dimensional certainty about things. And you know, one of the reasons I love the ThinkIn format is because it does actually, to a considerable extent, melt that, which is very rare in contemporary contexts.
Simon.
So I completely concur about expressing uncertainty as a sign of courage. And you can go back to John F. Kennedy, I think it was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he came on air in front of the United States and said, yeah, so this thing happened. We're not 100% sure what we're going to do, but we're thinking about it, and we've got some good people on it. We'll get back to you soon. You know, that idea of proposing that we haven't got it all figured out in a pretty important situation is kind of courageous, where now everything has to be binary or certain. I think is a very good point. The courage of uncertainty, the courage of saying I don't know. Which I think is hugely powerful, and that's the case at political levels as it is personal or in business. I appreciate the point about systems as well, and which is there are those that have the power to control systems, build systems, influence systems that few of us have. Let's be honest, but then we're subject to it, and I think it's that wonderful paradox. That I think it plays off that wonderful paradox that the paradox of being human, that at every moment of every day, we are both individuals and members of groups. Mm-hmm. And to your point about, you know, being an individual and being society, both are true simultaneously. And sometimes it's difficult or complicated. So I appreciate that point.
So Simon, can I just bring it on that Katie Driver? Because I should just say to Ryan Stocky, if you're in North Dakota, you probably don't know what the 31 bus is. But in my city, in London, the 31 bus never comes until 5 of them come at the same time. And what's happened to me in about the last 2 weeks is that for the first time I came across the theory of the power of weak ties, which I know everyone knows about, but I've never heard of. And it turns out that it's one of these ideas then that you just keep on hearing from everyone. And Katie has made this point, which in the context of listening and relationships and the benefits of deep ties, weak ties, meaningful or less meaningful relationships, I just thought was a really interesting point. Katie, are you there? And able to, hello there.
Hello. Yes, I mean, I was struck just tying together the thread from where we started about how if we're working virtually, there is so much more of a risk of being in an echo chamber with the colleagues that we already know, the people that we already know how to reach out to, the neighbours that we see in our own space as we walk around the block. But actually, when you look at what really helps with work, with socializing, with listening, with getting better with difference, it's the weak ties. It's the kind of people beyond our normal networks who are really going to stretch our thinking, stretch our ideas. And certainly some of the stuff I've seen over the pandemic has suggested that we've lost a lot of our weak ties. And I think that's a real problem. And one of the reasons why we need to to figure out how do we involve ourselves with different people, different ways of thinking, and the like.
Katie, thank you. So Simon, do you want to talk about that?
Well, I mean, I don't have much more to add. I think it was well summed up. I mean, yes.
Can I take the reason I mention it is that it goes back to where we start, and the reason I think it's really interesting is that when I started out as a reporter, you would go out and you would meet everyone, right? You didn't know why you were meeting them, and then years later, in some curious way, a story comes along and you call them, and it is this power of the weak tie. You don't have a deep relationship, you don't have a meaningful relationship, but you do have a tie.
Yeah.
You know, you were talking about younger people and how we are changed. There's a question about whether or not, for all of us talking about a networked world, we're going to get into the habit of being more fragmented, more isolated, and less good at being in touch.
Yeah.
And how much that'll have a kind of business dynamic to it, a social impact. That's why I'm intrigued by it.
Well, we are seeing a generation growing up with fewer skills to build deep, meaningful relationships. And these are their words, not mine, when I've talked to them. That they struggle to form deep, meaningful relationships, which means, and I think this goes to weak ties, which is when they get to work. We talk about the courage of saying, I don't know, you know, that's a declining skill, but also to deal with stress and anxiety is to ask for help. And so we do see rising rates of anxiety, depression, and unfortunately suicides as well. And we see young people leaving jobs. This place is not for me. This place is not for me. And then I had a debate with a 16-year-old where I raised this point about learning to have conversation as opposed to all communication being written or digital. And she tried to make the point to me that they use voice memos, which means she'll leave a voice memo, which is basically like leaving a message on someone's answering machine, right? Just to put into context for old people like us. And then somebody leaves you a message back, and it's all in real time, but nobody's actually talking. It's just leaving messages, leaving messages, leaving messages, leaving messages. And she was trying to convince me that this is conversation. Mm-hmm. And again, and missing the point that conversation is not broadcasting.
Yes,
but conversation is interruptive and engaged and all the body language.
Yes.
But they've confused broadcast with talking.
I think that's conversation in much the same way that Fidel Castro thought that a press conference was 5 hours of him sitting behind the mic and talking. So,
may I ask a question of you in the group?
Yeah.
And it's something I struggle with. I have a weak idea, but I'm curious what the group thinks, which is, and it goes back to the point that was raised a moment ago about security and insecurity, and digital security and digital insecurity, that it's so rampant. And the thing that, which is we are very mistrustful when government wants to take away any of our rights, privacy rights and the like. But we seem to have no problem when credit card companies, for example, are tracking every one of our movements, every one of our spending habits, attaching it to our name and address, and then selling that information for profit, or the data that what did Tim Cook say? If you don't pay for the product, you are the product. Mm-hmm. With data tracking, data mining, which is the euphemism for spying. And clearly, I mean, the superficial is, but we derive an immediate benefit from using our credit card, where we derive no immediate benefit from government. And so the question is, what is it? What does government have to do that we will allow a greater loss of privacy for the greater good, or paying taxes, things like that? Whereas, and what will it take for us to tamper down on the amount of information that is stolen from us from credit card companies and social media companies, and just get a little more balance? It's something I've struggled with, other than the direct benefit. That's the best I can do.
The good news is that Rosie Garcia has got her hand up, which means she has the answer to this.
Good.
And that's it. And you're going to take your weak idea and turn it into a whole book. Rosie.
Hi, Simon. We actually met in London about 8 years ago, and
I remember. How are you?
I was just starting out, and you gave me a start with why coins, and it's followed me in every office. It's sat on my desk. So thank you for that. I think the problem is that government don't pay for advertising, and they don't start with why. So that's the difference, is that we are sold something off the back of human instinct, which marketing companies manipulate, whereas the government aren't thinking about manipulating us as humans who need something. They're thinking about their own benefit. So they're not starting with why for the normal person. They're starting from the top, from, you know, Eton silk or wherever it is that they came from, which isn't where we came from. So they're never going to connect with us because they're not normal people.
So, Rosie, can I say, I think that's really interesting, although, again, in the spirit of civilized disagreement, I don't agree. I think that there is a really big gap growing between what the public sector, i.e. government, has somehow lost its mandate for, and what the private sector, i.e. companies, have quietly accrued powers to do. And I think that's very curious, because while we protest at the intrusions of the one, the state, right, we somehow acquiesce at the intrusions of the other, the private sector. And I'm not at all clear that someone once explained to me that there's a difference between anonymity and privacy, but that at no point did we, in our relationships with tech companies, give them the mandate for either. So I feel as though this has crept up on us. And Simon, just to give you a sense of this, you know, I touched on this cyber point. We had General Keith Alexander, you may have come across him. He ran US Cybercom. He made a really, really interesting point the other day that we were holding a cyber summit. And he said, just think about the world we're in now, where essentially there can be a cyber attack on a private company, where it then looks to the US government to defend itself. But the US government isn't even informed, or not necessarily even aware of what that attack is, right? So you can't have the company respond, but at the same time, the company doesn't necessarily pass on the information to the government, to the state. I guess it's this, by the way, what I'm saying is your weak idea is a really good idea. This imbalance between consumer and citizen, between private and public, is a massively interesting subject, I think. There were lots of people are nodding. They're nodding, that's it. You ought to do some work. Can I finish up with one final thing, Simon, which is just to try and resolve an argument we had when actually I was on your podcast, a bit of optimism. Do you remember the argument we had? Is that as you would expect, I then picked a fight with the idea of the podcast itself and said asked you how worried you were about optimism bias, about optimism itself leading us astray. And that was we did it, I think, a fair few months back. And the real worry was in the UK, that optimism bias, keep on hoping that we were going to get a better outcome than we did, had really caused huge problems in the pandemic, in the handling of the pandemic. And people might say in the UK, in the handling of other issues too. But have you seen that? Do you think in the US, there are some circumstances where you'd say, look, optimism bias has proved to be a problem too?
First, we need a definition of optimism before we can have the debate, right? Otherwise, it'll be semantic. And I think you know my point of view, which is I think there's a difference between optimism and blind positivity. Blind positivity is just that, it's blind, it's naive, it's everything's fine, everything's good. If we just sit this out, everything's going to be fine. Optimism is the opposite. Optimism is not blind nor naive. It can accept that there are difficult, dark times that we are in. We can be in a tunnel. Optimism is the fundamental belief that the future is bright, but it doesn't mean that there is inaction. And it doesn't mean that there isn't stress or hardship. And so I do not believe in blind positivity. I think that's naive. But I also think that if you don't have optimism, all you are is reactive to darkness, and that just perpetuates darkness. So, you know, optimism bias, one would argue, is one of the things that made the United States the United States. You know, Europeans make fun of Americans for their optimism, but if you look at what that optimism buys you, you know, failure is socially unacceptable in Europe. I met the Spanish entrepreneur whom he, by his own admissions, made some very bad decisions, and he bankrupted his company. And he was a very big, you know, high flying, you know, big company. And he remembers, he was telling me, he would go into restaurants and people who he thought were his friends would look the other way and pretend they didn't know him after his failure. And in the United States, like, people put on their resumes, I started a business and it failed. Like, like we just don't, like, we love the try. So, arguably, the optimism bias does exist in the United States, and it has benefited it. I think it's the blindness and naivete when that starts to creep in, when all you have is hope, but that hope is not a strategy.
So I'm listening. As ever, when we get going, I lose track of time, and I really comprehensively lost track of time. Like, we're way over. I wanted to say a big thank you to you. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. I've developed a certain tick, which is when people say things I think are really good, I just underline, and I underlined extreme listening, listen actively, listen for meaning. I underlined all of those things. Perhaps the thing I underlined most was replace judgment with curiosity. And if I was brave enough, which I'm not, to get a tattoo, that would probably be it. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to you. It really is a special thing to be able to have these conversations, and not just the two of us, but as many people as possible. I hope that when you're back in town in London, we'll get to do this in our newsroom.
I hope so.
But for now, enjoy the rest of your day in LA. Everyone, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us. It's really great to have you with us, Simon. Thank you.
Such a joy. Thank you.